The third section of Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols is titled The Problem of Socrates, and it is divided by Nietzsche into 12 numbered sections. All in all, it runs about 7 pages in the portable Nietzsche. Section 1 begins with the observation that past philosophers seem to be unanimous on one question. Human life itself is no good. Life is bad. He mentions Socrates' dying words about owing a debt to Asclepius the healer, and he suggests interpreting this as Socrates' belief that life itself, being alive, is a sickness which is about to be cured, in his case, as he dies from drinking the hemlock. Nietzsche here is being ironic. He makes an ironic observation that surely all these wise men of past ages must be correct, and we must not disagree with them. Of course, Nietzsche means precisely to say that we will and do disagree with them. Perhaps, he says, just maybe, philosophers were wrong to hate life. Maybe there's room now for a philosophy that is affirming of life. This first section ends with a fantastic artistic touch by Nietzsche, suggesting that wisdom, philosophical wisdom, appears in the world as a raven, that is, a carrion bird, attracted by the stench of death and decay, not as Hegel's great owl of Minerva bearing wisdom in the twilight of an age. Section 2 of this part of the book begins with Nietzsche's insight, his key insight, that in the past, philosophy has been a sign of cultural decline. He's thinking here especially of the ancient Greeks. Socrates and Plato's philosophies, he thinks, show that Greek culture is failing. The Greek spirit is fading away. And he suggests here that there may be some common physiological or physical cause behind this. It's important for us to remember, though, that in addition to his genetic speculations, for Nietzsche, life is will to power, and so the rejection of life can only mean a declining will to power. This is a concept he does not use here, but it's plainly in the background. So when he accuses philosophers of being anti-life, when he accuses Socrates of being anti-life, he's meaning that Socrates is against the will to power. In Socrates, the will to power is not strong, but rather weak. Nietzsche mentions here his first and perhaps his best book, The Birth of Tragedy, the first half of which is worth reading if you want to get a deeper insight into Nietzsche's vision of the strength in the Greek spirit. 2 more quotes from this section I'll call your attention to. Nietzsche says that judgments about life, about the value of human life, can in the end never be true. They have value only as symptoms. This is a theme we'll see throughout Nietzsche's philosophy, that the fundamental philosophical commitments of different thinkers in different times show us the inner psychology of those people and of those cultures. So the fact that Socratic philosophy turned against life and against will to power tells us not so much about life as it tells us about the Greeks and about Socrates the man. And also, for a philosopher to see a problem in the value of life is thus an objection to him. That is to say, again, it's not revealing to us the nature of life, it's revealing to us the psychology of the philosopher himself. This is a point personalizing the nature of philosophy that we'll see over and over again in Nietzsche's thought. In section 3, Nietzsche makes some brief observations about Socrates' ugliness and speculates about them as possible signs of a biological or genetic decline in the Greek stock. In section 4, he notes other signs of Socrates as a decadent figure, including what he calls the hypertrophy of the logical faculty, meaning that Socrates' mind has grown inordinately large, like a deformed body part, somebody who has a giant foot or something like that. It's deformed and far out of the ordinary, and it's distorting, he suggests, the function of the entire person. Socrates is an enigma, in a way. He is both exaggerated and buffoonish and clownish, but he also contains secret depths, and this is the basis of Nietzsche's rather complex judgment and relationship with Socrates. He is opposed to Socrates, but also sees in Socrates this very deep psychological function. And Nietzsche refers in section 4 to this very bizarre equation, he says, the Socratic and Platonic equation, that reason, virtue, and happiness are the same thing. The way to become happy is to be reasonable, which means to be virtuous. And he says this is opposed to the past Greek spirit, the Greek spirit of the Homeric age, the Greek spirit of the warrior. We'll hear more about that later. In section 5, Nietzsche notes that Socrates is working at a time of cultural change in Greece, that we see in Socrates' time the turn toward dialectics or argument as a cultural form. He says this represents the victory of the plebs or the commoners over the noble classes and over noble taste. Noble men, he says, do not declare their reasons for acting or believing as they do. Noble people regard this as being in poor taste. They simply do and believe and act. An important quote here from Nietzsche: honest things, like honest men, do not carry their reasons in their hands like that. They have, as it were, their reasons on the inside, and they use their hands for action. Where authority and nobility rule, Nietzsche suggests the dialectician, the philosopher, is a buffoon or a fool. Noble spirits, noble men, command. They do not argue people into agreeing with them. In section 6, Nietzsche observes that dialectic is a tool of the weak. It is the weapon of last resort for people who do not have the physical strength to enforce their will. Those are the people who appeal to arguments and reasons to try to work their will on the world. We should consider this insight again in light of Nietzsche's belief that will to power is the driving force behind all life. The will to power, he is saying here, is weak in Socrates and his followers. That's the cultural change that they work in Greece. In section 7, Nietzsche considers some psychological speculations about dialectic as a form of revenge. It's the revenge of the weak against the strong, of the common against the noble. And he notes that the victor in argument, in a way, dominates and tyrannizes over his opponent by forcing the opponent to argue back at him. I think there's a good deal to be gained by examining this line of argument very closely. In section 8, Nietzsche notes that Socrates' appeal, the allure of Socratic philosophy, is as a new type of contest or struggle or agon for the Greek spirit. It's not that there's anything rationally compelling about Socrates, but that the Socratic struggle in dialectic is a new vista for the conflict between individuals. In section 9, Nietzsche says, Socrates saw that the Greek spirit had changed and that the world needed him. Socratic philosophy, he says, is a cure for the anarchy of the instincts, for the internal conflict that afflicts the Greeks of that time. Socrates, through his philosophy, achieves a kind of self-mastery. He's able to harmonize his instincts and triumph over them through the power of his reason. But this raises the question, why had the noble Greeks prior to Socrates failed to master themselves? Nietzsche doesn't answer this question, but I think part of the answer will be that their will to power was in decline. Note here and in other sections, Nietzsche is playing the part of the psychologist as much as the part of the philosopher. He's reading Nietzsche as a figure in Greek psychology, and he's analyzing these inner drives that he thinks go far deeper than the rational arguments on the surface in Socrates and in Plato. In section 10, Nietzsche notes that for the Greeks of Socrates' time, salvation, this harmonization of the instincts, would be either reason or nothing. They must either perish or become absurdly rational. And this seems to be the only available response to this cultural crisis. The cultural situation in Greece was that desperate. So this Platonic and Socratic equation of reason, virtue, and happiness turns out to be one way of holding the dark appetites at bay. Socratic and Platonic philosophy comes across, in this interpretation, as a kind of psychological defense mechanism, perhaps against nihilism or the collapse into complete nothingness or cultural despair. In section 11, Nietzsche notes that ultimately Socrates failed. He was not able to triumph over decadence, his own or that of his time. Philosophy turns out to be just another expression of that same decline and decadence. Nietzsche then gives us his view, which is that To fight against the instincts, even with reason, is itself a disease. It is decadence. It is opposed to the principle of life as will to power. As long as life is ascending, happiness equals instinct, Nietzsche tells us. So his prescription seems to be to set the instincts free and stop trying to conquer them with virtue and impose rational constraints on them. We're getting here more hints of what Nietzsche's ultimate reply will be to Socrates, what Nietzsche's philosophy will consist in. In section 12, the final section, Nietzsche asks some closing questions, some of them ironic or speculative about Socrates. Is it possible that Socrates actually saw the truth about himself? He forced the Athenians to execute him, Nietzsche notes, and perhaps this is because Socrates saw that his reason and his philosophy had not succeeded in escaping the decadence of his age, and that Socrates' self-destruction was his final act of self-outwitting. We could read this either as a surrender to nihilism, or perhaps just an admission of failure. Socrates realizes that the instincts he's combating against are too powerful to be tamed and controlled, even by his most powerful reason. This brings us to the end of the third section of Twilight of the Idols. We'll look next at the fourth section on reason in philosophy. Goodbye.